Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jessica Beck. I'm the Milton Fine Curator of Art at the Andy Warhol Museum, and today I am joined by the lovely Michael Hermann of the Foundation and the Warhol Foundation. And so today I'm doing a series of these talks called Curator Insights, where I'm talking with other experts about a large-scale installation and rotation I've been working on Warhol and Basquiat. And so I just did a talk with Franklin Sermons, the director of the Perez Museum, which will also be available online. And today I'm joined by Michael Hermann, who I'm so happy to have his time and his expertise. And so I thought, Michael, I would start by introducing you to our audience. So let's just do that briefly. Michael Hermann is a New York-based artist. He creates work that confronts the familiar from an unexpected perspective. He's participated in various guerrilla exhibitions since 2002 and participated in larger exhibitions as well. He received his MFA from Hunter College, where he studied with Robert Morris and executed his thesis under the advisement of Nari Ward. In 2016, he established Francis St. Charles, a company focused on producing culturally relevant projects. Hermann has also been the director of licensing at the Andy Warhol Foundation since 2005, during which time the foundation received 10 major industry awards. Hermann has developed notable high-profile Warhol projects, including collaborations with Calvin Klein, Dior, Comme des Garçons, Absolute, Supreme, and Perrier. And he's conceived of and produced an acclaimed monograph on Warhol's Polaroids with Taschen in 2015, but subsequently has done a total of 4 books: the Polaroid books, 7 illustrated books, Warhol on Basquiat, which is what we'll be talking about today, and Love, Sex, and Desire, his most recent book on the Warhol's early drawings, which I'm really excited to see, actually. But today, we're talking about this beautiful book, and welcome, Michael.
Thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, no, I started doing this research over the summer on Warhol and Basquiat and their relationship, and I started thinking about a way to think about the permanent collection under this new political lens and this kind of new access that we've been granted through the COVID experience, another sort of a pandemic, a global pandemic, which has hit us in a much larger way than the AIDS epidemic, but had me thinking about the idea of communication and connecting and public death in a way. And then also the murder of George Floyd that took place over the summer and how that spread throughout the world in a very major way. And I think created hopefully a lot of change. So I started thinking about Warhol in connection to race and his relationship with Basquiat, and thinking about this 80s moment for him with the AIDS crisis in New York, also the death of Michael Stewart that takes place in 1985, and how that shows up in their work together and in their collaboration together. And at the beginning of my research, I went to your book because you pulled together these amazing contact sheets, Warhol's contact sheets, and you've linked together the diaries. And so it's just become such a really important tool and research tool. And it's also a beautiful book that can sit in anyone's home as well. But so I wanted to start, I guess, for our audience, before I dive too deep into the specifics of their relationship, maybe to start with you and when you first started this book. And we've talked before about how it was, several years in the making, and you had to start a relationship with the Basquiat Foundation and all of that. So I wanted to start with where the idea started for you, and yeah, let's start there. Maybe like where did the seed start for this book?
The seed started really just from a sense of curiosity. And as an artist, I was always fascinated by Warhol and Basquiat and how they were nonconformists. And yet, through my work at the Warhol Foundation, I had this privileged opportunity to talk to people who knew them personally. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it sounded as if they were describing completely different people. Is this the same Andy Warhol that you're talking about? So in this moment where we're highly polarized and people are thinking themselves as brands and often want to consume an idea that's neatly packaged, I love this idea that both of them really defy that. And I think the relationship defies that. So I was very familiar with not just the diaries, but these photographs that Warhol took that were not printed during his lifetime. And both quantitatively and qualitatively, they told an amazing story and a very special story. Warhol talks so much about his relationship with Basquiat in the diaries. The amount of photographs, it's absolutely extensive and terrific, and was hard to whittle it down to 400 just for this book. And then that's where it really started, was this investigation. And it was just a personal kind of curiosity for me. And I very quickly realized that there was something here that would make a terrific book. And the last kind of two legs of the chair, so to speak, for this book, it was the works of art that they created together. And it was also the archives at the Warhol Museum. All of these four elements, the photographs, the diary entries, the art, and the archival material from the museum, came together to, I think, really give the reader an opportunity to understand the complexities of this relationship.
Yeah, and what I love in particular about looking through this, because there's this ability with Warhol sometimes to see the pieces all broken apart, or the projects in their own disciplines, like the painting happening over here, or the books happening over here, or the photography happening over here. But with Warhol, it's all really connected. And I think one of the things you were able to do in your book is show this lived experience that is happening and archived in the photograph, in the contact sheet, and then how that same day is archived in the diaries and how Warhol writes about it. So that's the kind of interesting thing I think that you were able to do with the book, is bring the diaries to life in a way, and to show that Warhol did actually go to the opening, Warhol or Basquiat's opening at Mary Boone, and he did talk about what Basquiat was wearing that day. And look, okay, this is what he actually ended up wearing to the Mary Boone opening. So, so I think that part of like giving it life is really interesting.
It was fascinating for me, and I feel like you are a fly on the wall in the relationship in many ways, because not only did he attend the opening of Mary Boone in 1984, he went with him to pick out clothes. And not only did he pick out clothes, he went in the dressing room to try them on with Basquiat. So, certainly a picture is worth more than 1,000 words. In the diaries, he may make mention of these things, like, I went to the opening at Mary Boone. You would expect him to do that. That makes sense. But when you see how that experience unfolds through the lens of his camera, it just adds so much more richness and vitality. And it really makes you feel like you have a strong sense of what the relationship was, as if you were a fly on the wall. There's even a moment where he talks about meeting Basquiat's mother. And again, that sounds great. And there's a picture of it. But what he doesn't talk about is that he created a painting of her. He did a portrait of her. And then from the amazing archives at the Warhol Museum, there is a thank you note that she wrote to Andy and talked about how it made her children's eyes twinkle. So when you add those pieces together, it just tells you such a richer story, and in a way that one of those things doesn't do on its own. You really need all of those parts to come together.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the other really amazing thing I think that you're able to do, is really highlight some of these archival objects in the collection. And, they happen alongside, you have, for instance, like the interview, the copy of interview of Basquiat interviewing Henry Getzeler. And then the cover, it's Dolly Parton's on the cover. So this copy of interview will be in a vitrine in this rotation I'm doing. So you were able to link up all these disparate components. So I was wondering, at what stage of putting this together did you work with the archives? Did that happen as like a later stage, and then it became like a way to link up some of the artworks? Or when did the artwork start to come into play in the research?
The artwork and the archival material came later. So the scaffolding of the book was the diaries and the photographs. But with that material, you then have to act somewhat organically, because then you can go into the archives seeking out specific things, whereas Warhol mentions that interview work, interview photograph in the diary. So of course you would seek that out. But then you independently go into the archives and you find all of this other stuff that might not relate directly to the diaries, but tell an important part of the story. For example, one of these gems that I was so thrilled to find was a 1981 postcard that Basquiat wrote to Andy with regard to an exhibition he had in Italy. So this is a year before they were introduced by Bruno Bischofberger. And here it is, Basquiat thinking of Andy and wanting him to be, aware of an exhibition that he's doing. So I think it really expands the story significantly when you look at these materials. So I was proactively seeking things, but I also was reacting to what I found there, and there were some real treasures to find.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's so great that, again, that postcard will be in a vitrine in the exhibition in this rotation. And I think what's an interesting point about that is the link between Warhol. There are many links between Warhol and Basquiat, I think, in terms of how they were as artists and people, even though there's this huge age gap between the two of them. Basquiat is very strategic at a very young age with his work. And I talked to Franklin about this as well. Even with his graffiti, he's doing his graffiti work around the gallery scene in Manhattan to make sure the gallerists know who he is. So it's like he sought out Warhol in kind of like a mentor, respectful, kind of like I'm looking up to you sort of way. But I think what ends up happening in the studio, and kind of what really comes to life in the contact sheets and in the photographs, is that Basquiat brings all this new energy into Warhol's studio in the 80s and brings a whole new way of painting and thinking politically about painting, I think, for Warhol. So that's kind of one of the major things I'm hoping to bring out in this rotation, is that Basquiat essentially teaches Warhol to paint again in sort of this large scale, faster hand painted way in the 80s, and really gives Warhol an access to like a new way to think about his practice. So, because I think, what you get on the contact sheets is Basquiat in the world, but in the studio too, and this real sort of energy. And so that's one thing I've been thinking about, is this energy, this youthful energy with Basquiat, but the strategy, very similar to Warhol's strategy in the 50s in New York, of going after advertising executives and really hunting down work, but also going after the major galleries in the 50s, and circulating, if you reproduce the early books, circulating his handmade illustrated books to executives like at different places. So I find a lot of parallel into that idea of strategy that you're talking about, like through this postcard.
I see it as well. And my view on that is both Warhol and Basquiat are incredibly talented artists. They're also really smart and really ambitious. And they saw this relationship as something that was mutually beneficial. And they both understood it. I don't think either of them somehow thought the relationship was something other than it was. They were both too smart for that. They were incredibly sharp. And yes, it was also, I think it comes through in the book for sure. It was very sincere and genuine, the relationship as well. But, Basquiat was seeking Andy out, and there were certain benefits in penetrating Warhol's circle. And I think the opposite is true. And Andy, talks about this openly in the diaries, that, Basquiat gave him entree to a circle of younger artists that really inspired him. And he talks directly about this in the diaries, and it's part of the book as well, where at one point he says he feels like he was just wasting his time over the past couple of years. And now that he's met Basquiat and all of these other incredibly creative and talented young artists and fashion designers and filmmakers, he feels like it's the 60s again. So I absolutely agree with you that Warhol was very much inspired by Basquiat. And I think it's also important to contextualize Warhol's career also in the 1980s. He was not as we see him today. A lot of people didn't take him seriously, and they just thought he was an artist who was cashing in and putting out products. So I think it's important to contextualize that as well.
Yeah, that's exactly it. He has this presence he's still maintained in Europe through a lot of his late 70s work, like the Mao series or the Hammer and Sickle that's happening. But in New York, it's like he's lost his footing almost as a serious painter in the gallery scene. And he's dappling in all of these other media projects like interview, television, doing the photography. And now here he has Basquiat to help him get back to the painting world in a way. So I'm wondering what because so many people, I think, often with Warhol, when you bring Warhol into the conversation with Basquiat, I think it often gets twisted. And kind of what you're talking about here is an important way to think, like it's Basquiat who offers the entry point or the invitation in. And I think that perspective is so important here, because I think sometimes the perspective gets twisted in a way where it's like people hesitate to bring Warhol into the conversation with Basquiat because they don't want to have this sense that Warhol's kind of like, his presence is so large, I guess, in a way. And I talked to Franklin about this idea because he gave a talk on Basquiat for his museum, I think in 2016, a few years ago. And he gave this whole talk about Basquiat's career. And at the very end, someone in the audience raised their hand and said, "What about Warhol?" And so he said, I've left him out for a reason. And so I think it's interesting. And I'm wondering, because it's been through research over the summer that my perspective kind of changed on how Warhol's painting actually changes because of Basquiat. And so I'm wondering, through your book, if you had one perspective going in, and then with the research and the way you talk now so fluidly about the diary entries and their relationship, what changed for you on the perspective?
I feel like the relationship is incredibly complicated. And what I like that has unfolded is this idea that, there's three sides to the story. There's Andy's side of the story, there's Basquiat's side of the story, and then there's the truth. Those three things are not with us anymore.
Yeah.
And so what do we have? And what we have here was this robust amount of primary source information so that we could understand really the ambiguities and complexities of this relationship. And I think what shines through here is Andy's passion, not just for painting in the physical sense, but his passion for art. And that's the broader sense of that entree that Basquiat gave for him for the younger downtown scene. And I think if you look at this book, what you realize is that the relationship was white hot for a relatively short period of time. And these are two icons of contemporary art. So a lot of times people will couple them together. But I think what Franklin Sermon, it seems like he was getting at, is that Basquiat would be Basquiat without Warhol, and Warhol would be Warhol without Basquiat. The fact that they came together, it's incredibly interesting, but it really was a moment in time, and fascinating moment in time, and one that I think requires this type of research and the type of exhibition that you're doing. But I think that the coupling of them oftentimes isn't helpful in seeing their larger legacies, because they both, died terribly young. They would have gone on to do all kinds of other things, and became who they were, I think, not because of one another, but it certainly was an interesting moment in time.
Yeah. And one of the major things so one work that I'm showing at the museum, and I can show you in a moment, is this collaboration sculpture. So this is a work. Do you know about this work? Have you seen?
I do. I don't know too much about it. I'm familiar with the work, though. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's been shown at the museum, but it hasn't traveled, and it will be in the exhibition. And one of the things I started thinking about was Warhol's connection to this Michael Stewart passing, and the punching bags in particular, and then the Last Supper painting of the Big C, these physiological diagrams, but in particular, the Defacement painting. I find it really fascinating that the color palette of this collaboration sculpture is very connected to Jean-Michel Basquiat's Defacement painting. And it has the New York Daily News screen printed canvas of Michael Stewart's death. And in particular, I'm really interested in this relationship on the punching bags and the Defacement painting and this black figure that shows up on the punching bags. So I think one of the larger things I'm really hoping to do here, because you have a great photo of the Defacement painting and the day in, October 5th, 1983, when Warhol makes reference to it. Or sorry, that's the Milan trip that he's referencing, but the artist could have been choked screen printed painting that Warhol makes from this New York Daily News article. And then Basquiat's painting, which he makes in Keith Haring's studio, it gets cut out of the wall. But I find this collaboration between them in the collection of the punching bags, which haven't fully been situated into their work together, and how this relates to some of Warhol's religious paintings that he's also making at this time, and then how it might relate to Basquiat's work on Michael Stewart and Defacement. So this is one of the kind of some of the thinking I'm doing in the exhibition. This painting, Physiological Diagram, Bruno Bischofberger references how some of these paintings might have actually been under paintings that Basquiat never came in and finished. So that's something I've been thinking about as well, and how it relates to something like Basquiat's 1983 Back of the Neck, which is so similar to Warhol's Physiological Diagram. So these are just other ideas that are happening for me in the rotation. So it'll have this large room with the punching bags, the Last Supper, and we can think and this collaboration sculpture, and we can think kind of differently about, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. We can think kind of differently about Warhol thinking politically about painting, perhaps in this moment through his relationship with Basquiat, thinking about language, using language in the paintings in a different way. You have all those black and white advertisements that happen in this later part of Warhol's career too. So, and I'm just really interested in that, I guess, this larger sense, this big impact that Basquiat left. As you say, like, it was a short amount of time and it was sort of white hot. It was like this intense heat of creativity, I think, and inspiration. And I think the other thing, and you referenced this, is respect between the two of them that was happening. And there was a fallout, it seems, after the Schifrazzi gallery show, the bad reviews of it. But it seems for me that my take is that Basquiat left an imprint on Warhol to kind of think differently about painting and scale. And that's how I'm sort of reading some of these later large scale paintings with Warhol, a lot of which we have in the collection because they weren't shown during Warhol's lifetime, or they didn't sell during Warhol's lifetime. So that's kind of one of the other things that's happening in this rotation, along with showing a lot of these photographs that were taken, that we have in the collection, that were printed from the contact sheets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One of the things that I learned in doing my research is that Basquiat really forced Andy to think about race and think about what it meant to be Black in America. The Michael Stewart paintings that were made by Andy and Warhol, there were a lot of people in the downtown New York art scene who were rallying around that moment. And so it was a big moment, not just for the two of them, but for New York City. And he was, a beloved artist within the community, and to have something like this happen really impacted people, and it impacted Andy. But there are moments in the diaries where Andy relays that Basquiat talks very directly to him and says, when they don't get entry into the limelight to go to one of the Jacksons, like a Michael Jackson after party, he says, now you know what it's like to be Black. And there are other moments like that where Basquiat, as relayed by Andy, forces him to really think about this in a direct way. Now, clearly, if you look at Andy's work, race is, something that he had been thinking about from early on. But I think it's one thing to observe it from afar and through Life magazine and the newspapers, and yet another thing to have someone who is a close friend and collaborator tell you very directly the challenges of being Black in America.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that was one of the big takeaways for this book, is that that's the only place I've really seen Andy forced to confront race in a personal way. Um, in my research, and I thought that were it not for Basquiat, he might not have had the opportunity to really to do that.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, and that's what I'm hoping to bring out, is this opportunity to think about Warhol's legacy in the collection kind of differently, and how can we think about the impact of race and where it fits into his story, which is predominantly white narrative, that you can look at with Warhol. So, um, and I'll have the TV episode as well of the two of them, which I think is another kind of great thing, is their friendship and relationship, and that sometimes it was quite flirty almost, like, the outtakes from this TV episode. I think Warhol is calling Basquiat, asking Basquiat to be his sugar daddy, kind of teasing him about how much money Basquiat is making at this point in his career, and saying like, well, you can take care of me because you're so rich now. So
Yeah.
I find that kind of element, which is playful, which is the playfulness of it. And you see a lot of joy actually in these contact sheets of Basquiat. Very physical. He's very physical, like has a very physical presence. I think that's another part of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And whether it's getting their nails done or exercising together, or
Exactly.
Basquiat hugging him in an elevator, there are these amazing moments of joy where even if you don't read anything in the diaries, you can genuinely see that these people like being around each other. They just
Yeah.
genuinely enjoy one another's company. And the $1 million smile that Basquiat has in some points, and even for Andy, who's not known for kind of doing that, it's
Hmm.
pretty terrific to see.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, that's what I'm working on, this like large project to just think differently about Warhol and Basquiat. And I've said before to you, but now getting to say in this public way, that I think the book is amazing. I think it's just a really important resource for people to be able to understand the links between these two forms of practice that Warhol's working on at this later point in his career, or the three forms really. You have the diaries, you have the contact sheets, and then you have the artwork. And so I think it's a way for people that don't have access to the museum to see how all of those things are really linked up together. Um, Maybe, Michael, I could ask you a couple of general questions too, about just like how you as an artist came to be connected to Warhol and the foundation, and maybe also as a background as an artist, how that helps you see perhaps the work differently, like how it leads you to these book projects of under-recognized parts of Warhol's practice, right? The Polaroid, the early 50s illustrated books, or the new, the love desire idea of these boy book drawings. So I'm wondering if your background as an artist gives you access in a different way to this material, or what the connecting is there.
Yeah, I came to work at the foundation as an art student, and I was an intern quite some time ago. And at that point, I knew Andy, and obviously studied him in school, but I wasn't passionate about Warhol, and in many ways, I was frankly dismissive of him.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until I really discovered Warhol's filmmaking and some of the earlier Death and Disaster works that I really understood Andy as a conceptual artist. And for me, the real attraction is that, and you've said this several times, and I completely agree. I don't think he really drew much distinction between the various creative endeavors that he did. For him, it was all part of one creative vision,
Mhm.
and he
Mhm.
wasn't neatly trying to box these things up. So to look at Warhol holistically in that sense, I think is the correct way, and is amazingly enlightening to see. So with that, I kind of dove in and was certainly inspired by Andy and what he's done. And I think as an artist, you can bring to it the sensitivities of having had to deal with the emotional aspect of being an artist, to understand the ego, but also the rejection and the insecurities. If nothing else, in this book and Warhol's diaries, you see that despite the fact that he was one of the most successful artists of the 20th century, he's incredibly insecure at many times.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
true
Mhm.
for most artists. So I think being sympathetic to that and having an artist eye has allowed me to approach this in a way that I think might be unique.
Mhm.
And when I put these books together, in many ways, I still think like a sculptor, and I'm still kind of creating things that way. It's probably a very inefficient way. I'm sure you have a much more efficient way of approaching these things. But for me, a lot of times it's, you make a mess with these materials, then you rebuild them, then you make another mess, then you rebuild them. And hopefully you get it to a point where it all makes sense.
Yeah. I guess maybe we'll end on like what your hope is for the book with people, like, what your hope is with thinking differently about Warhol. If you do have kind of an aspiration with that, or if that is a project, it's something that I care about, I think, with the collection is like, how can we constantly generate a new perspective on him and make sure that he's relatable to a contemporary audience?
Yeah, I do. I think that for me, the further we get away from Andy's passing and the greater his place in history and culture, the more he becomes a myth. And I've had the privilege of getting to know Andy, the brother from John Warhol,
Mhm.
to Andy, the friend from a whole litany of people, and he was a human being. And what I think this book shows is that it humanizes both of these figures, but I
Mhm.
think especially Andy Warhol, and it allows him to be relatable in a way that a large canvas on the wall won't, or a film or video of him in an interview, playing Andy and being very polished doesn't. It really, he puts his guard down with these diaries, and the photos that were captured in here are very unguarded moments as well. So I
Mhm.
think it humanizes Andy, and I think that's important for us to remember, is that he's not a brand. He is a human being, and he's a complicated human being with strengths and weaknesses and faults and wonderful attributes as well.
Mhm.
So that's really what I was hoping to get across with this book.
Yeah. Well, I think you were successful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful, and I can't stress enough how important it's been for my work, like to research and to put things together and make links and to just see it visually is so important.
Will you be including in the exhibition one of Andy's oxidation portraits of Basquiat?
I am gonna have the very, the really beautiful. It's in here, and we will share an image of it on this video. I'll have for viewers a photo of this, but it will be next to our large scale oxidation. We have another, just a plain oxidation, and next to it will be the portrait
It's
that he
great.
made of Basquiat. Yeah.
As an anecdote, that was one thing I struggled with in making this book is you know how did Andy come to decide
Mm.
for this portrait to urinate on the canvas, urinate on someone's face, like to make a portrait of Basquiat through this oxidation means. And I
Yeah.
always struggle with that because it doesn't seem like a decision that one would come to without some sort of, specific conscious intention.
Hmm.
And so I don't know if I've shared this with you before, but
Hmm.
I had an opportunity to talk with Fab Five Freddy, and I said,
Mm.
this always has bothered me. Like, I can't figure out, Andy didn't really do this for other sitters. How did he do this? And he said, oh, Basquiat loved his oxidation paintings. And he said, I want you to make my portrait as an oxidation painting. So
Oh
Basquiat asked him
wow.
to do it. And I just thought, as somebody who studies these things, a lot of times you come to content with assumptions. And this was one of those moments where I realized I should not have come to it with certain assumptions. And in fact, it wasn't Andy's idea; it was Basquiat's
Mm.
request. And he said, "I want this," and I just thought,
Mm-hmm.
how terrific is that on a variety of levels. But also the fact that in 1982, when they would have met, Basquiat
Yeah.
was familiar with those works. That also shows
Uh,
you, I think, how smart and sharp Basquiat was at that
yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and how well studied he was, because many people even today don't know much about those works,
Yeah.
and they weren't really shown during Andy's lifetime. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I
That's
thought that
so
was a
interesting.
terrific anecdote to share with you.
Yeah, that's so great because I do remember the entries where Warhol admits to how nervous he is about sharing those paintings with Larry Gagosian, actually, like trying
Yeah.
to get Larry Gagosian to show them. And what's interesting about that too is Basquiat's already shown with Larry Gagosian, and he's had his solo shows, and so around that moment too. So that's another way that Basquiat's kind of ahead of Warhol in some way, because he is having these solo shows with Larry Gagosian, and Warhol's still trying to get him to pay. He's trying to get Larry to pay attention to these oxidations. Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't
Yeah.
know that. Well, that's amazing, because that'll be in the, so people have to come. Sorry, people have to come and see this in person, and we'll be
Yeah.
sharing images online too. But hopefully, over the summer, people will be able to travel more again, and we'll have opportunities. People have opportunities to come to Pittsburgh. So
I'm sure it's going to be an amazing show, and I
yeah,
hope to see it myself. And congratulations to you on all your work
yeah.
getting it
Thanks,
to this
Michael.
point.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you for your time and this expertise and the sharing your book and the behind the scenes of the book and sort of what you do and your passion with Warhol. And so thank you for all of it.
Thank you
And
for having me. It was a pleasure,
yeah,
Jessica.